Meera Dattani, founder of the Deep and Meaningful Consultancy. Welcome to the Adda, a space for better conversations. This is a snapshot of one of our group conversations with Meera Dattani, who is the senior editor of adventure.com and a travel and culture journalist. In this conversation, Meera explores the intrinsic biases and the lazy decision-making that still exists in the media's portrayal, both in writing and in visual representations of communities. She shares examples of how the colonial lens is nuanced but permeates throughout mainstream media to perpetuate and exploit stereotypes, and how that harms our societies. The rest of the conversation was held in confidence for participants to be able to share and learn together freely. Hope you enjoy it. For more information, check out www.deepermeaningful.co/the Adda.
This is something that I've been probably thinking about, in the last year or so more than ever before. I come at it from a travel perspective, but with the work I've been doing on the Media Bias newsletter, I've realised just how insidious this colonial lens is. And I guess I think of it in probably, maybe there's more strands to it than the 5 that I've distilled it down to, but for me, it's number one, when you view stuff from this European perspective, which is certainly how the rest of the world has often been written about, and in my expertise of travel writing, that's literally how it began. So when the colonizers began to colonize, that's how travel writing started as a genre. But obviously that extends to all types of media. So number one, the problem is this centering of the European, the white observer in the things that we read. And that's, whether it is travel, whether it's to do with health, whether it's to do with sport, it seeps into everything. The second issue I have with this colonial gaze is how it homogenizes things. So it talks about, you hear it especially with places like Africa, you hear Africa talked about this one place. And people don't tend to differentiate between the tons of cultures and identities and languages there. But it happens in lots of other ways. It happens to India, it happens in Latin America. Then there's also the issue of miseducation. So when news reports or historical events are communicated through the media, through this white lens, you tend to have this very singular narrative that comes through, and you see that in things like how, for example, how Winston Churchill's perceived in the UK. Now, it's very few people that are like, well, there are people that are all bad and people that are all good, but most people are quite nuanced. And with someone like Churchill, it's really important to get it right, but you won't find the average person able to tell you about Churchill's views on Indians and what he said during the British Empire, the Raj, for example. So, and I think the other problem that the colonial lens and this colonial gaze has created is a sense of historical, kind of almost historical shame amongst people. So you find people not mentioning a key event when they're writing about something, because there's almost like an admission of guilt, even though it happened centuries ago, perhaps. But even if it happened 10 years ago, if you were not part of it, I genuinely don't understand why it's a problem to then talk about it and just have it in your, in that piece of writing or in that broadcast.
So won't acknowledge that it actually happened, or that there's a broader context to it.
Absolutely. Even if you look at something like Thanksgiving, this big celebratory feast in the US, but the way it's talked about in terms of this weekend, Americans celebrate Thanksgiving, actually it's a day of mourning for a lot of Native American communities. And you just, it's not as though these stories are hidden. I don't feel, I'm not saying anything really groundbreaking by saying this, but this stuff is still happening all the time now, where those stories are not, they could so easily be put into mainstream news or any kind of news article or feature article to give context, and they are a lot of the time. There are loads of good examples. There's lots of great writers and editors and publications who do that, but there's also an awful lot that don't. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how you get publications to do this more. I mean, for me, it's about calling it out and pitching the ideas that I want to write about, and making sure that those things are covered, and being quite brave and saying, look, I want to write about this, but I want to make sure that this aspect isn't edited out. And that's the kind of thing that can happen.
So can you unpick the little bit of like, what's the problem with it, right? So apart from the fact that it's not a true story, it's not a true and complete story of whether it's a context or whether it's of a time and a place, because some would argue that, yeah, that's the past, it happened, what's the need to be regurgitating the past, for example?
Yeah.
And I'm saying this to be contrarian.
Yeah.
So why, like, yeah, what's the...
Well, the problem is, and actually I did have some evidence of this, but I genuinely couldn't find the report, but there's a link, for example, in the way, say, for example, the media portrays Muslim communities, for example, and hate crime. So the problem is very, very real, in that it actually affects how us human beings then deal with each other and how we see each other when we're not given this full picture. And unfortunately, the education system, certainly in the UK, like, while there are individuals and there are brilliant initiatives out there trying to, decolonize curriculums, both at a school and a university level, it's not a national requirement. It's governments that set actual national curriculums. And yes, an individual history teacher can bring in, examples that are introduced by, say, the Black Curriculum, which is a organization, but it's not done at a national level. So the problem is, with this colonial lens, if we are constantly reading things and viewing things and seeing things in this way, that is the picture that we build up of those communities. And we tend to, it tends to paint them with this very similar brush, when there's so much variety and difference even within those seemingly large communities, and whether it's religion or not. So that...
Do you want to in terms of examples, like concrete examples of what a colonial lens looks like, do you have specific examples? Because then I'm going to want to unpick the difference between what is a racist lens and what's a colonial lens with you. But if there are examples of teasing out the subtlety, it feels like potentially colonial is a little bit more subtle, but yeah, do you have examples of that?
Yeah, so I've just picked out, I haven't got like a fancy PowerPoint, everybody, sorry, but I've just got a bit of a screen share. So I'll do a bit of a screen share and just show you some light to slightly heavier examples. So here we go. So just let me know when you can see what I can see. It should be a tweet, yeah? Okay. So this is it's a brilliant writer called Monisha Rajesh, who's written a lot about train travel around the world. Anyway, she recently wrote a piece about her journey around India, which was done some time ago. And this is the sort of example of a very cliched image that the Guardian chose to use. And she actually has, I've interviewed her, she's got the most amazing pictures taken by a photographer friend who came out. So even when it's almost as if we want to continue viewing, people want to continue viewing places through a certain way that makes them feel comfortable, and, oh, this is that, old India, and it's romanticized and mythologized. And actually, it was then replaced on her request with a much more modern shot of an Indian train station. On her request. Now, she's a particularly brave writer, I think. She's often calling things out on social media, and I really commend her for it, because I don't think I do it to the same degree. And it also takes a bit of other writers. So, this Paul Clammer's another brilliant writer. He I mean, he actually writes, "It's time to retire grumpy white misanthropes like Paul Theroux. There are so many more exciting voices out there." I mean, in this time in travel writing, but you could, this goes beyond that. Another, I'm going to kind of go, I suppose, towards one of the more recent awful examples for me, which is actually not to do with travel writing, but I'll just sort of I'll just quickly go through this, I'll quickly progress. This is something we talk about in our media bias newsletter, actually, this taking the actual individual away from the copy you're writing. So in this article, I don't like to name who's writer and all that kind of stuff, but it says, we drank our tea in a shack by the side of the road below the El Kadua tea factory, which was built in 1949 and is showing its age. Completely meaningless. The beautiful smiling stall keeper. There's no name. There's no. It's complete. To me, this is completely homogenizing, like random exotic woman. The beautiful smiling storekeeper in a red and purple sari told us she'd worked in the Middle East and offered us spicy chutney to go with our roti picnic. And then it moves on. So this is sort of like, I suppose, to me, 101 stuff. Like if I was editing this, it would have just gone. And then it can get a little bit more insidious by the quotes that people sometimes use. So this is a Vermont island in Indonesia, and it talks about an explorer's experience there, and the quote that they use. And again, I didn't really understand how in 2020 an editor doesn't think that this is not appropriate. Should civilized man ever reach these distant lands and bring moral, intellectual, and physical light into the recess of these virgin forests? I mean, don't need to read the rest of it. It's so it just continues to paint this picture of the developing world. Whatever is the right word for that. Even that is, up for contention. It doesn't place these places into a modern context. That they are thriving places in themselves with fashion scenes and business scenes and entrepreneurs and all the same stuff going on that happens here. We keep them in this box of the other, of this exotic place. Deepa and I talked about this. Now, I'm not going to question the work of the website, but I think Ange also sent me this a while back, if I'm not wrong. And to call yourself, Men Sahib in India as a travel blogger, as a white travel blogger, just seems really tone deaf, and continues to play into this idea of, slightly into white saviorism really as well. But also Mem Sahib was the word that, Indian slaves effectively had to call the wives of, presumably it was mainly male, army officials there. It's just, I find it quite mind-boggling that you would choose that. And then, I suppose you've got the type of media bias which goes back to what I was talking about earlier about why does it matter how we talk about these people, like what it can lead to. So the Times actually ends up deleting this, but they wrote about during the Wisconsin shooting, they had a tweet that basically described the boy as a bullied teenager who'd found purpose as a vigilante. Now, you this is something that I'm sure everyone's aware of. You very rarely hear an Islamic fundamentalist terrorist described like that. Now, it's all wrong, but the use of that language, to show any kind of sympathy in this way is, again, I see that as all part of the same problem. So whether you're talking about, using cows on trains or talking about basically talking about one culture in a way you would not about another. To me, it's a massive thing, this topic. Like, this is, every time I talk about it, I realize how big it is and how linked everything is. But that it is actually all part and parcel of a very similar problem.
So is that last example then, is that race? So is that kind of an example of a race-driven type comparison versus this kind of, they're all savages type colonial lens by which writers will talk about that othering? but the othering in terms of that superiority lens, that we're the civilized ones, and everyone else, you know, look at the cows on the train, on the train platform type.
Yeah.
So is that the distinction, or is that too simplistic?
I mean, probably everything feels too simplistic, because it's so, this is, you know, centuries of history kind of unraveling, and people talking more and more about it. But yeah, I would say that for me, there is a difference between a colonial lens and a racist lens, because I feel like a colonial lens, while sometimes it is deliberate and people know that they're writing about a place, I feel like there's not the same intentional bias as there is when whoever crafts this kind of headline. I feel like this is where racism kind of creeps into, you know, a respected, so to speak, publication. Whereas I think things like this are just because it's what we're used to seeing. You know, I wouldn't put any money on the fact that the picture editor thought, oh, let's present India like, you know, it hasn't changed. I think they're just used to seeing pictures like this about India, and so it sums up what people think about what they want to see, right? Whereas I think this is far more sinister.
And so do you think the colonial has enabled the acceptance of the colonial language and perception and perceived, the infiltration of that language has then provided a gateway to enable the racist?
You know, I've never quite thought about it like that, but probably, yeah, because yeah, I guess it has, because it's normalized viewing cultures in a certain way, and so when that just becomes so normal, you know, like there's you stop question, you know, people stop questioning you believe what you read a lot of the time. I mean, I know that now there's issues with trust within the media and what you're reading, but there isn't enough questioning of things. And the thing is, the problem is that when things are missed out, it's not like there's anything too correct. So if for years certain historical events have been glossed over or erased completely and things like that, there isn't even anything to correct if you don't know what you don't know. So huge swathes of populations in lots of countries, and this happens in so many countries, not just Western countries, where, you know, your national narrative is quite skewered, because it's sort of led by you know, it could be politicians who have made sure of that, you know, in certain countries, but it could just be the way, you know, we have quite a right-wing media, certainly in the broadsheets and, you know, most of our papers, like percentage-wise. So I would, yeah, to answer your question, I would say that probably years of reading with a colonial gaze, makes you not realize what you don't know because you've not been reading about it, and then it can, I suppose, lay the groundwork for articles like this. This wasn't an article as such, it was wording in a social media headline, but you find this kind of stuff in articles too, the sort of slightly sympathetic stance. I mean, I read there was an interesting thing about the lack of trust in media. I mean, I think what I found interesting about this particular article was that the problem isn't just what the traditional news organizations are doing, but it's also how much information people are getting from Facebook, WhatsApp, and Google. So when we talk about the media now, we also have to bear in mind the power of these three, you know, and the number of memes and things. You know, so many people that get their news off Facebook, but it's not even sometimes from an actual site. It's a meme, and it has it might have the source at the bottom, but not always. Like I've seen some that are terrible. And then obviously the influence of Google in determining what comes up when you look for certain things, right? So I don't think I can remember the names now, but for example, there's lots of Native American tribe names, and when you put them into Google, what comes up are car brands and towns and things that basically don't mention anything about the fact that this is a tribe. So even those names have been colonized and just moved on. So, you know, I'd say that, yeah, these three are also now part of media. And the other problem is that the rise in opinion journalism, which, you know, is good as well. You know, I like writing it, it's great. But it's sometimes, especially in terms of like press standards and things, it's a very fine line. It's like, yes, you have to be factual, but there is actually a lot of room for offence in opinion journalism. So, and, you know, if you believe in the freedom of the press, it does bring up lots of really interesting arguments about how far do you go. And I think that also comes into, you know, because obviously they're biased, they are biased articles, they're opinion articles, but they shouldn't be exempt from fact either. So that's another big issue, I think. So yeah, just the web just gets bigger.
I'm just really curious about that kind of, this idea of this decentralizing media point that you made. Meera, it'd be good to get your thoughts on this. And the idea that actually that decentralization and where people have become content creators in a much more fluid way. You don't have to, you don't have to publish in a Guardian or a Washington Post or a New York Times, for example, right? Medium, the growth of Medium as a platform, and also just that kind of, also the kind of up claps and the I don't know the language because I'm not cool, but all the kind of the clapping and the sharing and the kind of like I get sent a lot more Medium articles than I do Guardian or FT articles in my circle of here's an interesting thing for you to read. And then I question the credibility, like who's behind it, what's the story behind it, and maybe that's my kind of perceived bias. It's like all the election stuff. You know, I found myself going to traditional media because not the BBC, but, you know, I watched 5 days of CNN rather than knowing necessarily where to go for the critical thinking on the ground. Like, so do we revert back when we're thinking about trust on certain issues? Is it different media for different things? And as this decentralized platforms grow, will that mean increased representation in the mainstream? Is that part of the narrative of this?
You know, the thing now is there's so many media outlets, and it's almost hard to say, you know, Deepa, you and I were discussing like what is mainstream media now, because, you know, the more outlets there are, it's harder to actually say like the media, like what is it? Because for some people the mainstream might be BuzzFeed, you know, they're more likely to read that than watch like ITV or the Telegraph. But, you know, why do you trust certain media more than others? Is it because they conform to the biases that you already have, and that's what makes you trust it? Yeah. And actually that's where it starts to get really dangerous, because media and politics and advertising, those three things are so dangerously linked in many ways. So, you know, papers that have almost an obligation to serve a certain political agenda now. So can you really, you know, I would argue that certainly in recent times, it's quite hard to say the Telegraph has been producing, certainly from the news front, what I would call proper journalism. It's been quite propaganda-ish. And that's what happens when you've got politicians and media owners sort of in each other's pockets, as it were. So that also pulls into question media bias, and whether the journalists who work at certain places are sort of almost having, you know, they can't sort of say the actual facts and be as neutral. And that's the problem, you know, like proper journalism really doesn't have to be dry, but it certainly the news side of it should be neutral, fact-based. You know, it can still be analytical, exciting, thought-provoking, bring up both sides and all the rest of it. But and obviously then you've got the advertising, because there's so many more media outlets, everyone's in competition with each other. Advertising is, you know, everyone's trying to grab it all. So people aren't going to align, publications are going to align with a certain way of thinking if it's going to like put any advertisers off. And then going like going alongside all of this is the fact that local journalism has really been dented. I don't know about in the States. I suspect it's bigger there because your states are like, you know, countries in themselves, and you've got certain, I think local journalism in the US is stronger. But here you have such an erosion of local journalism. And so whereas before journalists would get their training in the local newsroom, because I used to want to be like a proper news reporter, it's not what I do, but I did a lot of local newspaper work experience. And, you know, you're going to the courts and you're on the ground, you're interviewing people, you're asking questions, you're at the police station every day saying what happened last night. And now you've got journalists who sometimes don't even leave their desk because they're just using Google for everything. And it's not to say you can't produce a good news article from that, but if you don't come with the skills to question the stuff you're reading, like I'd like to think I could write a balanced article just using Google because I've been taught about sources and primary sources, secondary sources and things like that. But if you don't know that kind of stuff, then that's also part of this problem of bias, is also how journalists are approaching how they write things as well. You know, I think generally, broadly speaking, people fall into a couple of camps of wanting to do the work and being completely tired of doing the work. And that's why you've got, you know, writers of colour, you know, becoming literally advertising themselves as, you know, features journalist and diversity advocate. But then you've got others saying, I'm so fed up of this. Like, I just want to write about, you know, why I hate my periods. And, you know, they want to write the kind of stuff that they see their white counterparts writing, you know, who don't have to really write about race or anything. So we need sort of more John Olivers, and I think that comes from feeling like empowered and educated, that he knows he can say that because he knows what the history is, right? So there's probably people we know amongst our friends who would like to challenge things that they hear, for example, you know, on Twitter or on a TV show or on a radio show, but that's the problem. Everyone's got to put that hard work in. And yes, people are, you know, I'm not a cynical person. I know people are, but it's so late. And it's like, is it enough? Like, feels like a kind of a ladder that's like, you're just at the bottom and yeah, everyone's on it and trying to do something. But, you know, I don't want to be like pessimistic about it, but, you know, kudos to people like John Oliver, but it's harder work for the people who are actually suffering from the results of some of these biases. So yeah, it's good to see people doing that. Maybe that will help other white people feel like
it's said in comedy, it's said in comedic reference.
Yeah,
right?
Which is even better if you can get your point across in a like a non-heavy way. And these are heavy issues. You know, I'm not saying they should be like minimized by saying, oh yeah, let's use comedy to teach people about empire. But you know what? I'm like a real whatever works kind of person. I'm not really rooted in a deep agenda or ideology. So if you can get that point across in a light way, great. You know, why not? So it's refreshing to hear that he's comfortable and educated and informed and confident enough to do that. We need far more people like that around. Yeah, I mean, look, for me, it's the world I work in. It is very much, there is still quite a lot of calling out to do. And for me, that is one of the few ways that I feel we can make a difference, is that bravery, you know, and confidence to have the knowledge to then go, oh, that's wrong, you know. And I think the more we learn about the past narratives and challenge narratives, the more, you know, I hate using that word all the time, empowered, but you just feel more confident. I think that's a better word. You feel more confident to say to an editor or whoever and say, you know, you can't say it like this. I think for me, the challenge is, you know, for example, I've hosted a couple of decolonizing travel writing conversations, but it's actually quite hard to bring certain people to a more intimate space like this because I think people don't feel like they do have that knowledge to contribute to something like this. And I'd love to get to a point where, you know, there are more unexpected faces in a conversation like this. But I still think people are a little bit scared. And there are also people that don't want to engage. Like, I am quite realistic about it. There are editors in my world who could have attended some of the stuff we've done in the last few months, some of the webinars I've hosted on travel writing specifically and decolonizing it, that were very accessible with writers on the panels that they commission. You know, it was not far removed. So in that sense, I feel like there's still quite a long way to go. But I think that's, for me personally, that's my biggest challenge if I kind of continue, well, not if, but as I continue a little bit more down this path with my Shivani, who I write the newsletter with, is sort of getting more people engaged in a way that is, I don't mean this to sound patronizing or whatever, but in a way that is quite friendly and light and accessible, because actually I think the more overbearing, preachy voice, much as I have total sympathy with it, because it's a bit like, God, you know what, I'm just fed up. Like, why don't you know this stuff? Why don't you know about slavery? Why don't you know about empire? You know, why don't you know about, you know, whatever the Raj or partition or whatever it may be? But the reality is that a lot of people don't. So what are you going to do about it? Like preach at them and whatever, or try and, like, as someone said, like call people in, you know, rather than calling people out, it's like calling them in. And that's how I've had more success. Say if I want something changed, an article is a slightly more gentle approach than a kind of like angry approach.
Yeah.
So I think the way people do it is going to be different, and some people wouldn't agree with me. I'm pretty sure like some writers who I know and like and respect would be like, no, I don't have the time to do it like that. But it's not my nature to do it differently. So, you know, I'll do it my way. And, you know, hopefully I'll do another debate on decolonizing writing later this next year. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see, like, a year on, how that will unfold, actually. And I think I'll feel braver then to actively approach editors and say, please come to this. It'd be really